The River Nile has been a source of life for millions over the centuries. Now Ethiopia is diverting water to build a giant dam. And those downstream who depend on the river don't know when or even if this can be resolved peacefully. Growing populations and threatened water supplies. How to avoid another death on the Nile. This is Inside Story. Hello, warm welcome to this edition of Inside Story with me, David Foster. Well, the Nile is not just a river in Egypt. It actually flows through 11 African countries, and Ethiopia wants to divert parts of it to create a $4.7 billion hydroelectric dam, the 11th biggest in the world. The longest river in Africa has two major tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile, the source of almost 85% of the river's water, begins in Lake Tana in northern Ethiopia and flows into Sudan. It meets the White Nile in Khartoum, where they then flow to Egypt as the Nile River. And it's here in Ethiopia that they hope to build the dam. The investment is part of a $12 billion program called the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which hopes to boost power exports. The move, though, has sparked serious concerns in Egypt and Sudan, those countries saying it violates a colonial-era agreement from 1959, which gives them rights to almost 90% of the Nile's waters. Well, for hundreds of years, Ethiopian kings have warned of their powers to divert waters of the Nile, but have never made good on their threats. The consequences of Ethiopia's dam could therefore be very serious for Egypt. As a dry country, Egypt is heavily reliant on the Nile for its water supplies. And those supplies could suffer a loss, it's estimated, of between 11 and 19 billion cubic metres of water while the dam is being built. An idea of what that means, a 4 billion cubic metre loss could turn 1 million acres of land into desert. And experts say that would cause 2 million Egyptian families to lose their livelihoods. The Ethiopian dam could also affect Egypt's electricity supply by between 25 to 40%, it's argued, which would leave Upper Egypt in darkness. And lastly, Egypt's population is growing. It's about 85 million now and could hit 150 million by 2050. To cope with all of that growth, Egypt will need an extra 21 billion cubic metres of water, which makes the dam construction even more serious in the long term. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by three guests live from Addis Ababa. Bereket Simon, Ethiopian Minister of Information. From Cairo, Lama El Hatow, co-founder of Water Institute of the Nile, specialising in water governance and climate change. And from London, Cleo Paskal from Chatham House, who specialises in water and food security and has written a book called Global Warring. Welcome to you all. Minister, if I can go to you first of all, what we see behind you, I assume, is an illustration of what the dam will look like. What about these assertions that downstream you're going to cause millions of people perhaps to lose their livelihoods and create an infertile wasteland, particularly in Egypt?
I don't think the purpose of this dam is to bring about hardships down in the downstream countries. The purpose of it is to generate electricity with the amount of 6,000 megawatts and to benefit from this. And I think with the cooperative framework...
Let me just butt in just for a second, so sorry about this, but the question was, do you think it's possible, even though that may not be the purpose, but is it possible that that could be the end result?
I don't think that would be the end result. The end result would be more flow of water from the Nile River to the downstream riparian countries, because we believe in Ethiopia we're doing a lot of conservation workers, environmental improvement workers, whereby we are enriching the underground water of the country so that we will have more waters in our streams, obviously going downstream. So I don't think that type of consequence will happen to any of the riparian states downstream.
OK, I'll come back to you on how long it's going to take to fill the reservoir and therefore how long the river might be sort of flowing at a lower level in just a moment. But let's go to Cleo Paskal in London. There have been a number of warnings. Let me read a couple of them to you. Bradley Hope in the National, this could destabilise Egypt in a way that would make the revolution look minuscule. Former Minister of Water and Irrigation saying millions of people can go hungry because of this. There will be water shortages everywhere. It is huge. Is it huge?
It is, and it's an indication of larger geopolitical changes in the area. The status quo, the political status quo, has been severely altered as a result of the Arab Spring, but also as the result of new players coming into the area like China. So the dam issue is just one aspect of the changes that are going on, massive changes, political changes that are going on in the region. And so moving forward, I think the region's going to have to look towards creating a river of prosperity for everybody instead of a river of division and grief. The word rival comes from the word for people who live next to each other on a river, and changing that paradigm is going to be critical moving forward.
You heard this story, a rumour, but it came from WikiLeaks via what they claim to be a well-founded source, that Egypt was planning, perhaps if this dam were to be built, to use a base in Sudan as an area from which to mastermind military action against the dam, to blow it up.
Yes, and in fact, if you speak to Ethiopians as you are, they'll tell you that throughout history, Egypt has potentially tried to undermine Ethiopia through Eritrea and domestic political unrest to try to weaken Ethiopia in order to weaken its ability to exploit the river. Now, what you're seeing with Somalia becoming increasingly fragmented and the division of Sudan and Egypt having to deal with its internal problems is relatively Ethiopia is becoming more powerful. And as a result, Ethiopia can start to exert some of its rights and access to the river. So the answer to this river issue is really an answer for stability throughout the whole region. If we can't find an answer for how to handle this critical resource, we're not going to find an answer for how to create a stable and prosperous region.
Lama El Hatow, I mean, you've specialised in studying the river, the benefits it can bring, the problems it can throw up. And for everything apocalyptic that I've read out at the start of this programme and we've mentioned so far in the discussion, the Egyptian government suddenly seems quite relaxed about it. Why is that?
I would say on the contrary, actually. At this point in time, there's been quite a bit of heat and quite a bit of discussion that's actually been going on and commencing in the last day and a half, especially 2 days, since Ethiopia announced that they were going to be start to divert the Blue Nile water starting from yesterday. So there's been quite a lot of discussions about it and quite a bit of negative talk, I'd have to say.
But far,
in terms of the government, I think that
people appear to have rode back a long way from this possibility of military action, the suggestion that millions of people will either go hungry or thirsty. And they now seem to be saying, the official line is, look, we've got this discussion coming up. I'm sure we can sort it out in a sensible way.
I think it's really important to note that the Egyptian government as it stands, or the President Morsi's government per se, is very different from the government, or the rhetoric that's coming out is very different from the rhetoric that was coming out during the Mubarak era. Maybe that was one of a lot more necessarily condescending towards our neighbors in the Nile Basin area. But when it comes to the post-revolution status, people are beginning to soften when it comes to the rhetoric and the tone and trying to look into form of cooperation and collaboration. However, that being said, there's still been a very much a standoff when it comes to on the part of the Egyptian government when it comes to talking about the CFA agreement, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, or talking about the Ethiopian Grand and Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, in terms of this is not something that we want to necessarily take part in.
Would the Ethiopians, in your opinion, have gone ahead and done this if it had been if Mubarak had still been there, if they didn't sense a certain weakness in the new Morsi regime?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, for number one, I mean, Egypt is in a very critical situation. Egypt is the most downstream country when it comes to the Nile River. It's the most vulnerable. There's a lot of reasons when it comes to, or a lot of arguments that are being used on the part of the Egyptian government when it talks about sort of Nile rights. That being in terms of historical rights to the Nile, looking at other agreements such as the fact that when you talk about population, Egypt is one of the highest populations along the Nile. Looking at, of course, the climate. Egypt is, in fact, one of the harshest climates in terms of being a hot, arid climate along the Nile. So looking at rainfall patterns, Egypt has close to minimal, whereas a country such as Ethiopia receives up to 2,000 millimeters of rainfall a year, as opposed to Egypt's only a meager 150 to 200 millimeters. So there's various reasons in favor for Egypt's discussion of looking into the rights of the Nile.
But the fact is, the fact is that both countries, if at the moment we're taking a look in particular at Egypt and Ethiopia, both countries need to take a bigger share of the water out of the Nile because their populations are growing at such an alarming rate. And Minister, what is it? Your population's doubled in 10 years. You wouldn't be doing this unless you were seriously worried about how you were going to be able to cope with the extra number of people, the massive population growth you've got.
Well, first of all, whether we have a bigger population or not, it's in our right to use our fair share in terms of using the Nile River. As we all know, the colonial era treaty had been one-sided and excluded Ethiopia and the upper riparian states from getting their fair share. And now it had been around 10 years since we all started negotiating on the cooperative framework agreement, whereby most of the upper riparian states have ratified the agreement and signed it, except Egypt and Sudan are
and this is one, just let me help our viewers here. This is an agreement whereby states other than Egypt and Sudan, as you say, would be able to do not effectively what they like, but a great deal more with the river than they would before, and would not allow Egypt to have the power of veto over what goes on the upper reaches of the Nile.
Well, if veto had been allowed, there will be continuity of the unfair and unjust old treaty. That's what we oppose, and that's what we have realized as an obsolete mechanism for a shared growth. Our proposal, on the other hand, is that of ensuring mutually beneficial ways, where the cooperative framework agreement takes into account the interests of all the peoples in the region. So in that respect, I think we can use the River Nile for mutual benefits and for the joint growth of every country. Nile is a big river. It had been there, and it had been a source of relationship between the upper and downstream countries. And with the new development that we are that's taking place here, we think we can use it more constructively and with a win-win mindset. That had been
Cleo
the
Paskal,
direction we
back with you in a minute, Minister. But Cleo Paskal, in terms of the history of this, it's fascinating to read that there was a colonial agreement in 1929, another one in the late 1950s, all of which seem to be weighted in the favour of countries such as Egypt and Sudan, and damaging to those other countries that have the Nile flowing through it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, I'm sitting here in London, which was, of course, instrumental in creating those agreements because they were essentially linked to British imperial interests. So, of course, they were giving themselves as much water as they could. And it's sort of interesting that Egypt is continuing that colonial legacy in the context of the region. And it's worth also remembering that those agreements fixed in place a sort of divide and rule construct, which was part and parcel of how the British Empire ran. And it would be very useful to get away from those divisive zero-sum game paradigms to try to create, as the minister was saying, a kind of zone of prosperity. Because right now we're thinking about the water just in the context of, will this leader be here or will this leader be there? But if it's in another location, it can actually act as a force multiplier for the economy. And then, for example, you can afford desalination plants, which would give you a different source of water. You know, there needs to be a rethinking of water use along the entire system.
Because
Egypt,
water is a weapon,
growing.
isn't it?
Sorry.
Your book was called Global Warring, and there are many people who believe that the next major international conflict, world war, if there is to be one, let's hope not, but would be because of water shortages.
Yes, I mean, again, as you say, I hope not. I think that, there's some pretty wise leaders in the region, but it will take a complete rethinking of geopolitics and geoeconomics and the geophysical changes that are happening, because of course this water agreement, which is, as you mentioned, kind of over 50 years old, assumes that the same amount of water will be in the Nile forever. But with climate change, we don't really know if that's going to happen. And as the minister said, it's actually very useful for a watershed region like Ethiopia to be involved in the river, because that gives it incentive to ensure the health of the river. If Ethiopia can't take out any water, why would they invest in making sure that the river is healthy? So there are a lot of different ways of working together to get away from the zero-sum game approach and create a new economy that will help bring other components in and create more stability and security.
Lama El Hatow in Cairo, what is it going to take from the Ethiopians, for the Egyptian people and the government to be satisfied that they're not being put in a position where agricultural land could go to waste, where there won't be water supplies, where they are actually sort of suffering? What does Egypt need from Ethiopia?
I think it's really important to note that with any infrastructure project, dam or otherwise, but specifically when we talk about the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that there's going to be positive impacts to this dam and there's going to be negative, and that's by default. That's with any infrastructure project. And this one isn't any different. That being said, the dam and sort of the impacts, looking at the impacts downstream on both Sudan and Egypt specifically, range, again, from positive and negative impacts. Now, what's important here is that with this infrastructure project, and in order for us to move forward, that we really begin to look at and focus on the win-win opportunities and solutions that can come about from this dam, and how Egypt can begin to cooperate with Ethiopia and Ethiopians alike with the Egyptians in order to find that common ground where they can both begin to actually approach this dam together. One particular actual solution would be an actual investment in this dam, and that would actually make things a lot of things move in the right trajectory when we can begin to talk about an actual sort of concrete solidification and unification of this collaboration between Egypt and Ethiopia.
Is it possible?
So that's one solution.
Do you think it's possible that in the event of increased tensions between the two countries, Ethiopia could use this dam as a means of switching off water supplies to those nations that it disagrees with?
Can I come in?
I'm going to get you in a second, sir, if I may, but I want to get the Egyptian point of view before I come to you.
I think it's important that the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi actually noted once that this in the launching of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, said it very publicly that this dam doesn't have to be a national dam. It can actually end up being a regional dam. And this was an invitation to both Egypt and Sudan and the rest of the region to actually become partners in this dam. And I think that was a great step forward, one that we maybe didn't take at the time, but I think that it's very important that we should take today.
But Minister, it is an Ethiopian dam at the moment. It is not a transnational dam. Your reaction to the question that I put to Lama El Hatow is what?
Ethiopia does not have such an intention. The only intention of Ethiopia is to use this water for production of electricity and ensure as well constant flow, regulated flow to the downstream countries. Let me give you one example. I think whenever we do such big dams, I think the benefits for the riparian states, especially for the downstream riparian states, is enormous. We have built a dam on the Tekeze River, which is quite big. But apart producing electricity for Ethiopia, the main beneficiaries of this dam are the Sudanese farmers. If you look into the northeastern part of Sudan, farmers there are getting more water, regular water, and the increase of the flow of water, even during the dry seasons, has been confirmed. The same would be true with the Nile Dam, because during the dry seasons, all the downstream riparian countries will get regulated water and constant flow. I don't think water and development of our water resources can be a bone of contention between all these countries, because what we're doing here is incurring a heavy cost in the construction of the dam, but the benefits are going to be mutual. You know, we control siltation to the downstream countries. We also ensure regular high flow of water to downstream countries. So I don't think this myth of war related to water resources happens here.
Minister, you and the other guests might like to hear what some of our viewers are saying. These are some of the things that have been put on Facebook, first by Matt Davis. Diverting rivers is an ecologically dangerous practice, he says. One mistake and Egypt could become the next Aral Sea, which we know has sort of shrunk enormously because of water diverted from it over the last 25 years. And Amjad Adlan Awad Yusuf adds, as a Sudanese, we support our Ethiopian brothers to go ahead in constructing such a great dam. Egypt has taken more than their share in Nile waters. Cleo Paskal in London, tell us about the possibility of water being used as a weapon of war.
Well, if it were to be used, it would be considered an act of war and retaliation would be legitimate. One would hope that it wouldn't come to that, but I think the awareness of that being considered an act of war would limit its use in such a way. I think what would be more likely is that through climate change or other issues, less water appears in the dam than the dam is designed for, depending on the dam design.
And do you believe, as some people have suggested, that it could take 2, maybe 3 years to fill up the reservoir, and the water that's diverted into that at the time would therefore no longer be going downstream, and that could cause, if not long-term problems, then major problems in the short term?
I'll defer to the minister on that. It's a technical issue. I know that dams are becoming notoriously unpredictable. The Three Gorges Dam still isn't full, for example. So with
let's hear what the minister has to say. Yeah. How long is it going to take you to fill this huge dam? And in the meantime, is it going to mean less water going downstream?
Well, first, allow me to respond to the first questions of the damage or the alleged damage that happened with diversions. What we are doing is rerouting the water from its original course a little bit so that we can start constructing the dam on the riverbed. So the flow of water to Sudan as well as Egypt has not been stopped. And I don't think using and developing water resources would be harmful. Humanity has been able to develop by controlling and developing its water resources. So this is not different in Ethiopia as well.
Well, I mean, look what happened as the reader, as the viewer said, look what happened to the Aral Sea. I mean, it's empty now.
What we're going to do is to create big lakes which will add up to the amount of water that flows downwards. But also regarding the time needed for filling the dam, we're not going to do it in a completely irresponsible way. We are going to do it responsibly. We know water has to flow both to ensure the downstream countries.
Minister, I'm going to have to stop you. I'm going to have to stop you at that point. One final word from Cairo. Lama El Hatow, do you believe what the ancient philosopher Herodotus, you find out all sorts of things researching this program, who said Egypt is the Nile and the Nile is Egypt?
Absolutely, that's true, but the Nile doesn't run only through Egypt. It runs through 11 riparian countries, and so it's not Egypt alone. However, there is something I wanted to just point out in reference to what the minister was saying. There's the tripartite committee, or the committee that was formed basically with experts from Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and 4 international experts to assess the impacts of the GERD Dam on downstream countries like Egypt and Sudan. This committee has been working to investigate the socioeconomic, hydrological impacts, all the different various impacts on this dam that this dam will cause. The issue is that this report, it was intended to be released in January, and then it was postponed to February, and then finally postponed to May, where it's actually intended to be released today. The shocking part was that
I'm going to have to stop you. I'm sure if this program were 2 hours long, it would not be enough. Bereket Simon, Minister of Information from Ethiopia. Appreciate your time, Minister. Lama El Hatow, we just heard from there out of Cairo, and Cleo Paskal talking to us from London. Thank you too very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Send us your feedback at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, David Foster, and from the Inside Story team, thanks for watching. See you next time.